Welcome to the Health Accomplice podcast. I'm your host, Alex, a functional nutrition guide and health enthusiast. As the Health Accomplice, I recognize our individuality and I honor your uniqueness. My mission is to help bridge the gap between all the credible information that's out there, and there's a lot, on diet, healthy lifestyle, and overall wellness, and your individuality. There is nobody like you. Let's work together to explore that as it relates to health and well-being and find out what works for each one of us so we can all live our happiest and healthiest lives. I'll be interviewing experts on topics like sleep, meditation, fasting, specific diets, psychology, and more. I'll always aim to make these topics as fun and interesting as possible so we can learn practical tips on how to apply these concepts in our everyday lives. So welcome to the podcast. I am so happy you're here. Hi everyone. I always say this because it's always true, but I'm very excited to be talking to you and sharing this episode with you. I might be talking a little bit funny. I hope you guys can't tell. I did recently get my 2 teeth pulled. I wrote a post about that. I will likely be doing an entire solo podcast episode about it because I have been getting a lot of questions about just pulling root canals as they can be highly inflammatory to our bodies. So stay tuned for that. It's definitely something I've been getting questions about. So super fascinated by that. Anyway, like I said, I am really, really excited to share this episode with you. It's a topic I think is really relevant. I mean, it's always relevant. It's about heartache. It's something that we all have been through. I mean, I have met people who have never been through heartache, but it's pretty rare. I think all of us have experienced some sort of heartbreak in our lives, and it is a very unique type of grief, and it is something we're dealing with now too, not just romantic heartbreak, but there's a lot of heartbreak with the fallout of 2020. There's, romantic relationships ending. There may be friendships ending. There may be moves to new cities, which in itself can be a type of heartbreak. There's a lot of similarities. Although in this episode, we mainly deal with, romantic heartbreak. So I'm talking to Megan Bruneau today, who is so amazing. I'm so lucky to have met her here in Nashville. I think it's serendipitous, and I do think that people come into your life for a reason, and I've just been loving spending time with Megan and learning so much from her. For those of you who may not know who she is a therapist, an executive coach, a speaker, a Forbes contributor, the host of Failure Factor, and also one of the most humble human beings, because half the stuff I did not even know about her until looking her up before I was doing this intro. Another thing I didn't know about her until now, I'm just looking at her site, is that Deepak Chopra called her out as the millennials therapist, which is pretty incredible that she's getting called out by Deepak Chopra. Our conversation today was so great because it got very vulnerable and real. We talked a lot about Megan's process as she's going through a breakup right now and her own heartache, and tips and tricks on how to navigate that because it's not easy. We talked a lot about the shame of heartache too. Sometimes we can be ashamed of our feelings and getting vulnerable to talk about how we're dealing with the heartache. We talk about, the differences between feeling, heartbroken and rejected, talk about ego. We definitely touch on attachment theory as well, which can be super helpful in understanding why a relationship may not have worked out, or understanding the dynamic between two partners, and just really understanding yourself better, which is really the key to all of this and the goal for this podcast in general, just getting to know yourself a little bit better. If you do want more insights into attachment theory, or you want to dive deeper into attachment theory, I do have an episode that I recorded with Dr. Jessica Waldron that goes into all the different attachment styles and can be super helpful if you're looking for that. However, today's episode with Megan is really about the heartbreak process in our own process. And hopefully you will find it as helpful as I did. Although I'm not currently going through a heartbreak, I'm definitely one of those people that has been through heart-wrenching breakups in the past and has experienced heartbreak. And even just listening to Megan's process today was so insightful for me, and I learned a lot too, and can apply some of the concepts to things I'm going through in my life right now. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy this episode as much as I did. I could have talked to Megan forever. I won't hold you up any longer from this juicy content, so let's get going, and I'll see you on the other side. All right, well, let's get started and talk about a little bit about who you are and your background and your story before we dive into our lovely little topic for the day. So can you give everybody just a quick overview of who you are?
Sure. So my name is Megan, and I'm a therapist and executive coach, and I also do some writing and speaking and podcasting myself. I'm trained as a psychotherapist, or in Canada, I'm a registered clinical counselor, so I have a master's in counseling psychology, and I have my own kind of personal mental health journey, or journey to mental health. I've struggled with eating disorders and depression and anxiety, and kind of through combining psychology and spirituality and holistic health, I've found myself in a place where I'm far more balanced than I used to be. So I try to just spread those messages to others who might be going through some of the same things.
A lot of people who are in this profession too, not only therapy and counseling and executive coaching, but just health and wellness in general, we all have our kind of own stories, and they're all personal stories too. And that's how we get into this line of work. So on that note, what was your big aha moment of when you decided I'm going to go into therapy and help people, and specifically around the attachment theory and relationships, and obviously eating disorders as well?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I totally agree. I think we teach what we know, and we're so lucky, those of us who are in helping professions or see ourselves as healers of sorts, that we get to kind of hold people's hands and walk them a little closer to where we are, or we're able to get to, I think. And it's interesting because I actually I always knew I wanted to be a therapist. I remember a conversation that was very clear that I had. I think I've told this story before, maybe on other podcasts, but I had with my dad when I was really young. And I'm pretty sure my parents were still together, and they split up when I was 8. So I would have had to be 8 or younger. And I remember being like, Dad, I want to be a singer when I grow up. I was a terrible singer. But I loved singing. And I want to be a singer when I grow up. And he was like, you'll never make it as a singer. And I was like, okay. And then I was like, all right. Well, and I thought about it, and I was like, well, I want to be an artist, because I liked painting and drawing. And he was like, you can be an artist as a hobby. That's something you can do on the side. And I was like, okay, well, I think I want to be a writer. And he was like, no, you won't make enough money doing that. And then I think I remember saying something along the lines of well, I wish I could talk to people for a living. And he was like, you can. There is a job. It's called a psychologist. And I was like, you can do that? You can talk, people pay you to talk to them? Because I was so chatty.
Yeah.
And he was like, yes. And so that was the first time I'd heard of a psychologist. And I'm sure that wasn't the only reason I was really interested in it, but that was the first time I knew that was something I could actually be. And so when I was in high school, I was actually lucky that my school offered psychology as an elective. So I took it in grade 11 and 12. I'm Canadian, so we say that instead of 11th and 12th grade. I loved it. I loved it so much. And then I immediately went down and did my undergrad in psychology, and knew that I would want to do my master's in psychology. So it was never really a question. But I think when I was in high school, I was really struggling with eating disorders, and I was definitely struggling with depression and anxiety then too, but I just didn't know it. I thought I was just really negative. People always told me I had an attitude. I would get that from teachers, and it would just be the feedback that I would get. It's oh, Megan's really she's just got an attitude. She's got a chip on her shoulder, and she's I was really.
I can't picture you having an attitude.
It's so funny, right? Because I'm so positive, and but I think I don't know. I think that positivity was there, but I just felt so alone, and I felt really resentful toward my parents, and I was rebelling. Yeah, exactly. And at that time, I think I really wanted to also figure myself out. And I thought that if I just became a psychologist, which I never became, by the way, psychologists have PhDs usually. I don't have a PhD, I just have a master's. But I thought if I became a psychologist, then I would ultimately like be able to fix myself. And it's, you know, it's hilarious because it was actually when I was finishing my master's, like really the last year of my program, that I was rock bottom with eating disorders and depression and anxiety, all fueled by perfectionism.
Can I ask what your eating disorder looked like?
So in high school, it was primarily bulimia. So, you know, eating disorders, you know, all eating disorders are what we call restrictive disorders. You know, even binge eating disorder is a product of restriction. And so for me, what happened was like dieting and thinness was really valued in my family, and eating disorders are rampant. Like pretty much every woman has, and man, I think, and if you count over exercising and whatnot, has developed an eating disorder of some sort or an addiction of some sort. And I started dieting when I was probably like 13 or 14, maybe even younger than that, honestly, but like really dieting at like 13 or 14. And then of course, because I was restricting, then I started binging. And then because I started binging, I started purging, making myself throw up. And so, and it was like initially, it definitely was kind of like an emotional thing and a rebelling thing. Like I actually remember the first time I made myself throw up. Like I was at my dad's house, you know, he had like, we'd gotten in a fight about something, or he was just being a dick, or I thought he was being a dick. And I like remember it so vividly. I was like, I'm gonna throw up my dinner. Like, I don't want this dinner that my stepmom made for me. I'm like, fuck this.
Yeah.
And it was like an act of rebellion.
Yeah.
And then it became like a tool that I thought I was using for weight loss, but actually, you know, of course, it's not really effective in that means, or it's not effective for losing weight. And I then just got into this vicious cycle with bulimia. Usually the cycle is like binge, purge, restrict. So I would, you know, after purging, I would feel really guilty, and then I would restrict, and then I would be super hungry, and then I would binge, and then I would purge and restrict again. And so that was the cycle I got in. And it wasn't just physiological, like eating disorders, of course, are really psychological as well. You know, there's a numbing component to it. And for me, like, I didn't know how to deal with my emotional pain. Like I didn't, because of, you know, what I grew up around and the troubles I had in my family, my parents weren't really able to be there for me. My dad left physically and my mom left emotionally when my dad left. And so I just learned to like numb my feelings or not feel them. And I was like super hard on myself. I had a lot of shame, and bulimia, I think bulimia saved my life. I'll often say, I'm like, thank God for bulimia. You know, it was my best friend at the time. It got me through some really hard times. I still was, you know, the captain of the tennis team, and, you know, valedictorian, and got into the great university and did all these sorts of things because I had this coping mechanism. Now, it wasn't the healthiest. And then what happened was I went down to university. The bulimia, like, it kind of went into remission in some ways because I was living in dorms and it was harder, and like, but it was still very much there. It was only because I wasn't like, I didn't have the access as much, you know? And then when I started my master's, I became a personal trainer, and I became really obsessed with fitness, and I started restricting and not purging, or no, sorry, not binging or purging. And then it really just took the form of anorexia. And so for the next few years, I struggled with anorexia until I finished my master's, when I was totally rock bottom. And it's actually interesting because, you know, we may get into it, but I'm in the middle of like a pretty massive heartbreak right now. And my boyfriend at the time, who I was with for 3 years, he left me, and it like turned my world upside down. And this was my big kind of window into my spiritual journey, in which first I guess because of what I'd seen with my parents growing up and the pain I saw my mom go through after my dad left, it was really important to me that I never had my heart broken. Like I was like, okay, I need to do everything I can to make sure that no one will ever hurt you. And so eating disorders were a big part of that. Like if I stay thin, you know, thin is so important. Men like thin women. Like if you stay thin, then nobody's going to leave you. And so when my boyfriend left me when I was super thin and, you know, just finished a very prestigious master's program, and, you know,
basically you were like, I'm perfect now.
Yeah.
How are you making
Right.
me?
I was like, but no, like the world, like they lied. Like some people lied to me. I'm like, this isn't supposed to happen. And I think that happens to a lot of us when we have sort of, we just become so powerless, and we feel kind of flipped upside down, and we're like, wait, but if this, then that, and this like equation isn't working. And so Pema Chodron calls it like going through a period of groundlessness. And so actually at the time, someone gave me the book When Things Fall Apart by Pema Chodron, which is like completely changed my life and really introduced me to Buddhism. Yeah. And that combined with me starting a yoga practice around that time, because I'd had so many over-exercising injuries that my physical therapist was like, I just like kept being injured. And my physical therapist was like, Megan, like you're actually going down a road to like really like hurting yourself like beyond repair. And like if you keep going for these like long runs and like, you know, like going to the gym every day, like you're gonna never be able to do this kind of stuff again. And it scared me enough that I was like, okay, I guess he's like, you can do yoga. And I hated yoga. I was like, oh, it's so boring. And like the weird spiritual component I wasn't into. But anyway, I started doing yoga and I did start feeling myself healing both physically and emotionally, which, you know, going through this massive heartbreak at the time was really interesting. Like I could feel myself like actually letting myself feel my feelings in the yoga room, and starting to notice this like critical inner voice that I had, and notice myself comparing myself to others or beating myself up. And I had just at that point I'd finished my master's and I couldn't get a job, and this was another like sort of place of groundlessness. I was heartbroken, I was unemployed, you know, there were all these sort of like other sources of like loss and transition in my life. Through my eating disorder, I'd really isolated myself, so I like wasn't really connected to anyone. And so one of the only things I was doing was yoga, but I couldn't afford it because I didn't have a job. So I got a job at the yoga studio for like $12 an hour, like cleaning mats and like swiping people in. And it was the most like humbling experience because I had been so like, you know, overconfident and sort of arrogantly like, well, I finished this prestigious program, I'll be fine and get a job afterwards. And I didn't. And so like, you know, there I was with 7 years of education, like, you know, cleaning mats in bathrooms. And that too was like kind of a spiritual opportunity. And I just kind of dedicated myself to my yoga practice and until I got the ground underneath my feet again and you know, worked on healing my heart. And in the process, like really studied spirituality, and realized that so much of the pain that I was experiencing, especially through that heartbreak, but even up until the heartbreak, was because I was really judging myself for my feelings. I was judging myself for my pain. And I read When Things Fall Apart. And I remember too, I'd read that book, the poem, The Guest House by Rumi. If you're familiar with it, it's something along the lines of like, you know, that being human is a guest house, every day a new arrival. And the idea is, you know, we have all these emotions that come in and, you know, our job is to welcome them, no matter whether they're comfortable or uncomfortable. And I remember vividly, like one morning after this heartbreak, I woke up and every night I would dream about him still. I'm in that phase now. Like I'm like dreaming about my ex all the time, and I would wake up like, and I would feel this sense of relief at first because I'm like, oh, it was all a nightmare. We're back together.
Yeah.
And then I would have this moment where it would like flood in and I'd be like, fuck, we're not back together. You know, like it's over. I feel emotional right now because like that's what I'm going through. And I remember like thinking, wow, sadness, like, okay, like here you are, and I wish you weren't here, but like you can be here, like come on in. And up until that point, every time I felt sadness, I was like, you're too good for him, get over it, move on. And it was through sort of like accepting my sadness and just letting it be there that I realized that so much of my pain and suffering that I created up until that point was because I wasn't just feeling like the sadness of the heartbreak. I was feeling shame for feeling sadness. I was feeling anxiety for feeling sadness, you know? I was judging myself.
Shame is like the worst feeling ever.
It's the worst.
It's something I feel like a lot of people deal with around so many things, right? And
yeah, it's interesting. Shame, like there can be, in rare cases, it can be serving. And I think something that's always helpful for people to know about emotions is that they are evolutionary and there is a purpose for them. But the problem is, oftentimes the way we feel them nowadays doesn't serve its evolutionary purpose. So if you think about, you know, living in cave person days, if you felt shame, it usually meant you were doing something that would have you ostracized from the group. And so you wanted to feel shame because it would stop you from doing that. It would make you want to be accepted so you would belong. And belonging was really important because that led to procreation. That led to being safe. Exactly. Yeah. Survival, getting in on the kill, you know, making sure that you were protected at night when you slept and you're sleeping in groups, staying warm, all of that kind of stuff. And so really all emotions are what we call pro-social, and they're meant to keep us in groups and keep us, you know, surviving. So, anxiety tells you to watch out or prepare, or loneliness tells you to connect. Guilt tells you to repair a rupture in a relationship. And shame, in some cases, it can say like, hey, there's this thing about you that's antisocial, and you do want to hide this from others, or you do want to change this about yourself. But the problem is, now we live in a world where we feel shame for not being perfect, where we're inundated with messages about, on Instagram and, the media that we grew up with, even like, if you don't look this way, or if you're not skinny enough, or if you're not pretty enough, or if you don't have a successful enough job, or if you don't love your job, or, if you don't have a perfect relationship, or if you don't have perfect kids, or if you don't have kids, or, obviously, I'm sure everyone listening can relate to whatever they feel shame around. But basically, we're told that we're humaning wrong, we're doing it wrong. And so if we're not perfect, then we're going to be rejected. And that's why shame is so ever present.
I have so many questions.
I know, sorry, I did a lot there.
No. There's so much to unpack real quick while it's still top of mind. Perfection. Can we talk about perfection a little bit? Because,
sure.
And as it relates to your story too, because I feel like, sometimes when people go through a breakup, they think, especially if you're the one being left behind, if, you're the one being broken up with, you may think, I wasn't perfect enough. Yeah. I did something wrong. Again, that feeling of shame where maybe if I was smarter, prettier, more successful, funnier, more easygoing, maybe if I went camping versus being so high maintenance, like all the things.
Totally. Oh my gosh, hilarious. I remember having that thought with the breakup in 2011. I was like, if only it was that one camping trip where I was grumpy.
Exactly. I'm like, damn it.
Yeah.
But I feel like, that's always just the wrong road to go down. So could we talk a little bit about how that relates to your journey in the breakup? Did you go through that? How do you advise people who may be going through a breakup to like not even go down that spiral, because it is not going to lead you anywhere good? And actually, we were just talking about this before we started recording, but there's no intimacy in perfection.
Totally.
So the less open you are about those imperfections, the more you prevent yourself from truly finding connection with other people.
Totally.
So it's all wrong. Well, there I go, shaming somebody, right? Like, sorry about that. I'm not saying it's wrong. It's just not going to lead you down to anywhere good. So can you talk a little bit about when you were going through that initial breakup, how did your partner then know about your eating disorder? Did he know, or were you open about it? And when you guys broke up, it sounded like you were like, wait a second, I was like in perfect mode.
Yeah. Where
I was the quote unquote the perfect version of myself, because I was super thin, like accomplished, beautiful, all these things. Like, how could he possibly leave me?
Totally. And I love that, what you're saying about no perfect in intimacy. I think that's very aligned with everything Brené Brown talks about, and vulnerability being the window into connection. And which is easier, I think, for women than men, unfortunately, because men do get mixed messages. With toxic masculinity, they're told that, they're still supposed to be these like they're not supposed to cry, and they're supposed to be like, have it all together all the time, but then also they're supposed to be vulnerable. So there's sort of this like perfectionism, vulnerability thing going on as well. But as it pertains to my breakup in 2011, so what was interesting about that one was initially I was like, but wait, I was perfect, I don't get it. And then of course, you do the like post-mortem and you go back and you're like, but I should have done this and I should have said that. And it's interesting because like, I do look back on that breakup or that relationship, and I wasn't my best self. I was really going through it, in terms of my mental health. There was a lot of stuff going on in my family at the time. There was just like a lot of stress, and I didn't know myself well. And we did have this kind of like anxious avoidant dynamic. And I think I probably didn't give him the space that he needed and deserved. And I did expect more from him than he could really give me. But either way, I felt so much shame after that breakup for many years. And I felt rejected. Like, I didn't just feel heartbroken. I also felt rejected. Mm-hmm. I also felt like I wasn't this enough, or I was too that. Even with my eating disorder, I was like, well, maybe I was too thin. He wasn't attracted to me anymore. The woman that he ultimately ended up with, not much later, I think there was some crossover there, was in a much fuller body. And I was like, wait, he was more attracted to that. Like, I shouldn't have lost so much weight. It was just like, I was so fixated on trying to be, to go back and be like, if only I'd done this, if only I'd done that. And it's interesting because, well, for so many reasons. Like, first of all, we need to be able to go through challenging periods in our relationships, or at least I need to be able to, right? Like, I mean, I know there are partners who would prefer to just kind of like keep their eyes on their own mat and, you know, deal with their struggles on their own and kind of come back together. But for me, like, it is important to me that my partner is able to sit with me through some of those challenging times.
Yeah.
And
hold space for you.
Exactly. And hold space for me, because otherwise, unfortunately, and this is, you know, some of the attachment stuff that you referenced, like, we do unfortunately like seek out what's familiar to us. So if we grew up with the message that like emotions are bad, or we're too needy, or we're too sensitive, or, you know, people will leave us if we need to demand too much of them, or if we're too emotional, which like those were kind of the messages I grew up with. And that's what I sort of saw unfolding between my mom and my dad. And then I sought out someone the same who, you know, was really uncomfortable with my emotions and did ultimately leave, probably because he was overwhelmed by them. And I can't fault him for that. Like, that's just how he was wired. But either way, for so many years, when I look back on that relationship, I felt so much shame. Now, what's interesting is going through the breakup that I'm currently going through, it's been a very different experience, and it's still been excruciating. I mean, don't get me wrong, you've seen me cry so many times at this point. And even, you know, a few minutes ago. And it's still been like just really, really hard. Human. Yeah, totally. And I'm not afraid of my tears anymore. That's the nice thing. Like, I think I was so afraid of my tears back in 2011. And now I'm like, oh, like they're just a reflection of love. And it kind of feels cathartic. It's like an emotional cleansing, or otherwise, you know, you're going to get health issues. Yeah. And so I am still very emotional about it. I'm still absolutely devastated, heartbroken, like still very much in denial in some times of the day. But I don't feel rejected, and I don't feel shame. I feel heartbroken. Yeah. But it's really interesting, because rather than that heartbreak fusing with shame, because emotions do that, by the way, like loneliness fuses with shame a lot, anxiety fuses with shame a lot, because we're judging ourselves for them. Rather than them fusing with shame, first of all, I can totally give myself permission to feel them because I know they're valid and warranted. And secondly, I'm like, you know, there's nothing I could have done differently. Mm-hmm. Like, I was not perfect. We went through a pandemic together, you know, like that was really hard. We slept in, I think, close to 30 beds lived out of a suitcase for 11 months. Like, we were disrupted from New York. I was grieving the loss of New York. There were so many other things that we went through that I obviously won't share on air, but like, it was a hard last year of our relationship. And as I think it has been for so many people this past year. And I look back and I'm like so proud of myself for how resilient I was and how I handled it. And I was not my best self, but I don't think anybody was. And that's where I was like, you know, they're really like, I don't look back on it and think like I should have done this or I should have done that, or if only I was more perfect. Like, I think I was just me. And I always felt like I was acting within my integrity for the most part. And if I didn't, I was, you know, I think I made up for it or was apologetic about it. And so it's weird looking back, because there's no shame. And then the rejection piece, you know, this is something I'm still in the middle of processing. I mean, you're getting me pretty fresh into it. It's a few months out. I think I'm sort of in this place where I'm just trying to come to understand that some people are just wired differently, you know, and it's hard for me to understand because I'm not wired that way, and I'm very empathic. So I'm like trying to put myself in someone's shoes as though they're me, but I can't because they don't think and feel that way. So I think like I know how hard it is to not feel rejected when you're going through a breakup or heartbreak. Like, it's just so, and when people tell you it's not about you and like it's them or da-da, and it's so hard to like let that really land. But I think I don't know.
Can we dive into that a little bit further? Because you made me think of something just in the breakups that I've been through myself, and I'm sure your other breakups too. Like, I have definitely been in a place where I felt rejected and heartbroken and shame, all of those things when dealing with a breakup. And then, of course, on the other side of it, I've been exactly where you are, where it was just heartbreak. Yeah. And noticing the difference, I ask myself, okay, well, there are people listening that are like, wait, I tell me how and what are the tools, because I feel rejected. Yeah. And for me personally, it's actually a spiritual practice, right? Because it's based on beliefs. Yeah. If you have a belief that, like you said, you were your best self, and if you have a belief that it isn't really that personal.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously that's so hard to like take because
Yeah.
nothing, like you're like, well, it is personal because it's me and it's affecting my life. But what I mean by it's not personal is that it has nothing to do with you as a person, but everything to do with that other person, where they are in their life.
Totally.
And what they're capable of and what their capacity for things are.
Yeah.
And who even knows, and I don't know the answer to this, but what if it's even like somehow protection for you?
Totally.
Because I've been in situations where I have 5 years later have seen where that guy who broke my heart ended up. I'm like, thank God.
Totally.
That they broke my heart, because that is not a road I would have wanted to go down.
Yeah.
So I think it's a matter of like truly having that belief of like, wait a second, I've got to understand and know that this isn't, it's affecting me, and let's feel those feelings and go through the heartbreak. But it's not always about me. It's that person everybody's on their own journey.
Yeah.
And that person's on their own journey, and they don't have the capacity to give me what I want now.
Yeah. And it's interesting, like, I like the way you described it as a spiritual practice, because I think there is just this freedom in trusting, which again, I know you have to practice doing, but just trusting that like, this isn't supposed to work, or it's not supposed to work right now. And the visual that comes to mind for me is like, I'm not a big puzzler, but I have done a couple during the pandemic. And like, when you think you found the piece and you're like, oh, here it is. Like, this is a piece. This is it. Like, we're going to, I'm going to finish this side or whatever. And you go to like put it in and you're kind of trying to make it fit and you're like trying to jam it. And you're like, why isn't it working? Like, that's how I feel like I have been with this relationship. Whereas I think my ex was like, no, the piece doesn't go there. Like, and so for them, they never were like, this piece is supposed to be here. For me, I was like, no, but we can do it. Like, let me just jam it. Like, if I just squeeze it a little hard, and so I think like my work is accepting like, okay, this piece doesn't go here. And I think maybe they saw it, more clearly than I did. Of course, I'm still in a place where like, I hope that changes down the road. Maybe we'll like get some scissors out and fix the puzzle piece. But I think the other thing that's really important that I tell myself, and with every aspect of life, is that everyone is our teacher in some way. And so this person, was a beautiful, super powerful teacher to me in so many ways, and teacher to me about myself and my past and my patterns, and really held a mirror up to me. And I think that's ultimately what relationships do. And I think we do get too caught up in like, did the relationship work or did it not work? Like, I mean, relationships are like, they're these like incredible experiences. I mean, we were talking about this before we went on air, some of our past relationships beyond this one or these ones. And like, they're just chapters, there's powerful, powerful chapters in which we can have like beautiful shared experiences with someone, who we hopefully love and loves us. And, if and when it ends, it doesn't like negate the value of it. I think it's so unfortunate that our perspective, it does come out of this fear of pain, right? Like, because we're all collectively so afraid of difficult emotions and we want perfection, we're afraid of an ending. We're afraid of heartbreak. And so we're like, oh my God, they have to be together forever. And yeah, I mean, I think like, so trusting that this, if it didn't work out, it's not supposed to. And it doesn't mean that you didn't get so much out of it. Like even, I mean, just like practically speaking, I'm like, wow, how wonderful that I was with someone throughout the pandemic. Like that would have been really hard for me, who's like so extroverted and so like emotional, to be on my own for that long. I think would have been really hard. I wasn't going to go back to Canada. My family's not really the one that I want to go like spend a pandemic with. And so, I love them, but like not it wouldn't be probably the healthiest environment for me. And so I had someone and their family, I was with their family as well, for a lot of the pandemic. And that was just like so incredible and so beautiful, and like offered just like healing beyond, what I could have imagined. So I do think like when we have the capacity to do so, we can look back on our relationships even after they've ended and pull out all of the gifts of them and the lessons and what we can move.
Hopefully the lessons will keep on coming. There are moments in time where, I mean, the breakup I'm talking about, I had a serious relationship almost 8 years ago now. So it's been 8 years since we were together, and we broke up then. But there are times where I'll be like taking a walk or going through something. I'm like, oh my God, now it all clicks. Like that's what he taught me. And so it keeps on giving sometimes.
Totally.
You're like, oh, that's what he meant by this.
Yeah.
And now I get it, or I like get his perspective. And I don't know, there's definitely beautiful learnings to take out of any relationship. It's just really hard to see them when you're fresh out of it.
Totally.
That's why it's so like 8 years later, you're like, wait,
yeah,
now I can see with clear eyes.
Exactly.
Can you share a little bit of maybe what this last breakup has taught you? Or
Yeah,
like how he was your teacher?
Sure. I mean, some things I'll probably keep to myself just because it is so fresh and I want to be like respectful of his privacy. But what I was alluding to before when I said we're sort of drawn to maybe what's familiar, we're also drawn to the parts of ourselves that like lie dormant that we want to develop further. So that's why often, that's like why opposites attract or whatever, right? And that is often at the core of that kind of anxious avoidant dynamic where you have someone who's a bit more self-oriented, another person who's a bit more other-oriented. And, there can be codependency that can come out of that, but also it can just get into a dynamic where like one person seems to be a bit more of like the giver and one person more of the receiver, but the giver is happy in that dynamic until they become resentful. So it's like, it's neither person is like right or wrong. It's just like a dynamic that you get into. And it's also sort of like the chase distance dynamic. So one person's the giver is kind of more like the chaser and wants to be spending more time and wants more intimacy and connection. And they actually kind of recalibrate in intimacy and connection. Whereas the person who's more of the distancer, they tend to want more space and they recalibrate or come back to like a set place of feeling in control and stuff in emotional distance, at least sometimes physical distance. So as you can imagine, it can be sort of a challenging dynamic because one person is always wanting more intimacy and one person is always wanting more space. And then you get into something called the power struggle. And so in terms of this relationship, you were joking about it before, like I can't imagine you having an attitude. Like I am a very warm, positive, like loving person. I just have like an endless well of love, and compassion often is my downfall, because I don't do it with boundaries all the time. And at the same time, I think there is a dormant part of me that is very selfish and wants to set boundaries and kind of wants to
like ask for what you need.
Wants to ask for what I need, wants to be really clear and direct in all of that, but struggles because that's just not what I've learned to do very well. And so I was really drawn to that in my partner. Like I was really in admiration of their ability to be so clear and direct, and they're very successful and powerful, and they seemed to know at least like what they wanted and could articulate that. And it was just, to me, I mean, that was so attractive. And of course it got us into that dynamic that I described, but that, I feel so grateful because like spending time with him over the last couple of years, it did teach me to be more like, he was really, supportive in terms of my business and career, and like, you should say this or not say that, or you should ask for more money, or, don't let that friend treat you that way. Like I had, and have had like a number of friends that I don't even notice like that I'm sort of in a not a healthy dynamic. And he would have said like, oh, that's not a nice thing that person said to you. And I'm like, oh no, but it's okay, they've got, they had a really hard childhood. Like I'm like,
you're
always doing that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And he's like, it doesn't matter, like, or certain things like with even my family and stuff like that. And so that was like, he was a really good teacher in that way, in the sense that he really helped me be able to, I guess, understand a little bit more about boundaries and setting them and being direct. And it doesn't mean that, because with someone I have like a pretty serious abandonment wound, which is often where the anxious attachment comes from. As I mentioned, when my dad left, my mom did too. And so I have a fear that if I ask for what I need or want, then people will leave me. I can't ask for what I want. If I ask for what I want and it goes against what somebody else wants, then, and I like stand firm, or if I set a boundary, then they're not going to stick around. So I have a really hard time setting boundaries because it might mean that a person's like, okay, peace out. Like if you can't meet this need of mine. So he really helped me with that. And a couple of other things, like, as I mentioned, I spent a lot of time with his family over the pandemic, especially, and they're incredible. And like, I might cry talking about it. Anyway, but like what was so beautiful was like having this time with his family that was like so functional, and like had family dinners together every night. And like,
it's like the childhood you didn't
yeah,
have.
it was. And there was a lot of grief in that. Like I really, I struggled because it's like, you don't know what you don't know. So for me, a lot of my childhood, I didn't realize what I wasn't getting, you know? And again, I mean, I got a lot. Like there was always food on the table, you know, like that kind of stuff, right? And I'm, you know, my dad was very successful, and I, you know, could do every activity, and you know, when my parents split up, I got to stay in my childhood home. I didn't have to move into like a 1-bedroom apartment or anything. So like, I'm very aware of my privilege and everything I had, but there was a lot of stuff that I didn't have. I didn't have harmony. I didn't have family dinners. I didn't have consistency.
Being seen.
I didn't feel seen. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so this time that I spent with my ex's family was so intense because I was having this like grief coming up that I wasn't prepared for, and I didn't know how. I wasn't like equipped to deal with it. I didn't know how to navigate it alongside everything else. So that was like painful, but also really beautiful because it was work I needed to do. And then to like spend time with this family, like it almost like it proved to me something that I thought was a fantasy could actually be a reality. Because I, until that point, like was very skeptical, and I was like, oh, like there's no such thing as like a like perfect family. I mean, it's not a perfect family, but like there's no such thing as a family that like everybody actually wants to hang out and they look forward to spending time together. And I really genuinely looked so forward to spending time with them, and everyone was just like warm and positive and consistent and loving, and it was beautiful. And so until that point, like I really had always been like, I don't know if I want kids. Like, I don't know if I want a family. Maybe I'll just like be, you know, and that was probably a defense mechanism. I probably just didn't trust I'd ever have the opportunity. But that time spent with his family really showed me like, you can have a family that's like healthy and happy. And like, that's a gift. I mean, I could have never imagined. And then the final one is that, you know, my ex actually like, you know, has some similar qualities to my dad. Not, you know, he's very different in some ways, but just in terms of that wiring piece, you know? And so I think it really helped me see that some of the stories I'd been telling myself about who my dad is and why he never seemed to want to take an interest in my life or my brother's life, I up until that point, up until this relationship, I'd really taken that personally. And I'd really thought it was because I wasn't perfect enough. And if only I'd scored more goals, you know, if only I'd gotten straight A's, you know, which I think I did actually. But,
I'm like, weren't you
valedictorian? But no, I didn't always get straight A's, you know, and it's like, and like,
do you think you did all those things for like seeking?
Yeah, I think so, for sure. I mean, I think that was the perfectionism part. And also it was where I got validation. So like I didn't get validation anywhere else. So I was like, okay, well, if I get straight A's, if I do well in school, I did well in school and I liked school and I was popular at school and I was good at sports and stuff like that. And so like I actually loved school because it was like a place where I actually felt seen. You know, teachers saw me, coaches saw me, people like the older boys in grade 12 saw me, you know? And so so I think like this experience, you know, being with my ex, like, and this feels vulnerable to share, but like it, you know, he's an incredible man and I love him so much. And I like, you know, really do, of course, like there's still a lot of pain there, but I do hope, you know, the best for him and everything. And it taught me that like, you know, maybe there's some similarities there with what my dad wasn't able to give me, you know, or some of the rejection that I felt from my dad. Maybe it wasn't rejection after all, you know, maybe it was just those puzzle pieces that couldn't fit together. And, you know, my dad saw it, and it's different, like a parent-child relationship. I mean, I think parents do or should have an obligation to make an effort to help their child feel seen and continue the relationship, even, you know, if it's hard for them. It's different in a romantic relationship, you know, but it's allowed me to really like liberate myself from some of those stories I was telling myself about not being good enough. And so, yeah, it's those are kind of like the main lessons.
Those are incredible lessons.
Yeah, it's been really, I mean, again, it's totally, I mean, the pain is totally worth it.
I mean, that's like substantial.
Yeah, super substantial.
Just those three things that you said are so beautiful. Like the first two, so expansive.
Yeah.
To like watch somebody, you know, take ownership over their needs and wants and be vocal about them. Like we all need to do that. Totally. And then the family thing. And then also just like, father-daughter dynamics.
Totally.
Just maybe allowing you to see your dad in a different way too.
Yeah, with a lot more compassion. Like it allowed me to. I always had compassion for my dad, but it's hard, you know, when
so hard
when so you don't feel like you're getting when you didn't get what you wanted or felt like you deserved, and you know, you as you get older too, I think like you do start to really see, like, it's the same thing as like, wait, I didn't have family dinners, that's kind of weird, you know, like you start to see these things and you're like, oh, there's something that I should have maybe had, or my life would have been different if I had that. And you don't know it when you're a kid. When you're a kid, you're like, oh, this is just how life is. And then you start to like compare as you get older, and you hear these stories, or you tell stories, and people are like, that's kind of fucked up. Like I would have some of that, like you'd share a story and be like, no, that didn't happen in our home, you know, like and so I think like compassion, nobody's obligated to have that for anyone, but it can be so liberating. And for me, it's really allowed me to love my dad from afar.
Yeah, it's so healing in that way too. And then also just back to the whole family thing and setting boundaries and asking for what you want. I think it's just important to also have that become a reality, because similarly to you, there are things that I didn't even know could exist until you actually see them, because when you're growing up, you're programmed one way, and yes, you see things on TV, but like if you're a pretty intelligent person, you know TV is not real, so you can't, it doesn't resonate as well. But once you see it in real life and you're like, wait a second, this person actually has this family dynamic that I didn't think was possible, and now also maybe you like that and you want that, and you're like, oh wait, I do want this, and it becomes this like, now it's like it goes on your list of like, now I'm clear on what I do want. And that's also kind of you were going to say something.
Well, no, I was just going to say too, and the other major lesson, like this kind of ties into that I just want to mention as well, is like that family dynamic, and then also feeling accepted into it, even though I just felt like I was a mess, right? Like it was a pandemic. I'm like a therapist. I'm seeing so many clients. I'm like, you know, having all of these like moving parts. Like, I can't go back to Canada. Like there was so much stress, and I was a mess. Like I cried a lot. I was exhausted. I wasn't sleeping. I was so stressed. And we were living with his family, you know? And so I was so scared that I was going to be like found out, quote unquote, I'm using air quotes. And that's the shame piece, right? So I have this deep, deep shame that like my perfectionism like is what gets manifested, and people see this perfect. I mean, it's not perfect. You clearly don't see a perfect version of me anymore, but like I like have this curated version of myself that is very polite and helpful and blah, 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 and quiet and poised, but like I couldn't keep my messiness like hidden. And so to show my messy self and still have his family be like, we love you, we accept you, we welcome you to dinner. Like it was so like painful and healing at the same time, because I was like, wait, you're not supposed to accept me like this. Like this is my broken self. Like this is the part of me that I've worked so hard to hide from everyone. So like it was just something that like no amount of therapy could have helped me with. So that was just last one, that's why I had to share.
I know this has been not an easy breakup, but it sounds like there were a lot of healing aspects to it, which so healing. But it's so wonderful that you can see that, because sometimes again it's so hard to see when you're like in the thick of it and it's fresh and you're seeing it for what it was. And I think that, you know, anybody going through a breakup, I you know, that's what helped me too when I was going through my breakups. It's like, wait a second, let's think about the things that were healing about this or expansive about this. What did this man or woman or partner show me that I didn't want, or what I did want? Did you? That kind of brings me to my next question. It's like whenever you're dating or in a relationship, whether it's a serious long-term relationships or just going on dates with people, it's kind of a really great, what's the word I'm looking for? Like an experiment of like what it is that you do want and what it is that you don't want. And it's kind of like, okay, I like this and I don't like that. I like this and I don't like that. I want this. Like, oh, actually that relationship showed me that I do want to be with somebody really assertive. Or not. Or maybe like you're like, oh, that assertion was too much for me. Maybe I just want somebody to like follow my lead and do what I want. So what are some of the things that you learned, if you can share?
I think just because of the nature of the question, I'm going to practice my boundaries and not answer this one, because I think it will be too, I don't think that's sensitive to my ex. But I will just speak to the point that you said about sort of finding the gifts in a breakup. And for me, with this relationship, and really like with most things I do in life, I think if we're conscious, you can always look at it as a positive thing and something that's teaching you. So like, as long as you're not sleepwalking through your life, then you can always look back and be like, I made that decision eyes wide open. We make our decisions based on the information we have at the time, right? So even if the experience is just, I had a beautiful experience with somebody I enjoyed spending my time with, that's enough. Like, it doesn't have to be, not everybody listening has to have had like some profound experience that's healing in their family or, with their trauma or whatever. I constantly ask myself, in that relationship, I always was asking myself and kind of reevaluating, like, is this still right? Like, and this is what we should be doing in relationships. Not every day. I mean, it can get, that's where because people have something called relationship OCD, but like, you do want to be kind of checking in and being honest with yourself. Am I staying in this out of loneliness? Am I staying in this out of fear? Is this giving me what I need? Do I need to ask for something more? If I'm asking for something more and it's not being met, is it because my expectations are unrealistic? Or is it because maybe like, this person can't give me what I need? And if they can't give me what I need, do I want to, relax my expectations or compromise or whatever? So I think like for anybody wondering what they got out of the relationship, even if you can't pull like significant lessons out of it, or you can't do it for a while, just knowing that like you had shared experiences with someone you loved, I think is an experience enough. And if it was something where it was like abusive, or you do look back and you're like, wow, I was like really, deceived or manipulated. I mean, those are very, very painful experiences. And I do think that they can still be opportunities for us to see parts of ourselves that we need to heal and work on. And that's by no means meant to victim blame or anything like that. Of course, many of us are and have been, victims of abusive relationships and, very unwell people taking advantage of us. I've certainly been one of them. And that has helped me see that there are parts of myself that I do need to still heal and turn inward to those.
Yeah, that's beautifully said.
Thank you.
2 more questions
Sure.
before we sign off. These are a little bit more like practical. So, practical tips in getting over a breakup. Like, what do you do other than like eat ice cream and cuddle with
a lot of ice
this
cream
like beautiful cat over here?
Oh my gosh.
What advice do you have?
Well,
Are there resources? Are there books? Are there podcasts? Obviously, you have your own podcast.
Yeah. Gosh, I mean, I should come up with a comprehensive list. I mean, the number one thing I think is self-compassion. So what I mean by that is sort of what I was referencing earlier, turning inward toward your emotions and noticing them, recognizing them, acknowledging them, validating them. I say to myself, I've used this sentence for a decade. It's understandable I'm feeling whatever I'm feeling because. So that's just like a self-empathy statement. Like, it's understandable I'm feeling heartbroken because I just had heartbroken. Mm-hmm. It's understandable because I'm feeling lonely because I just spent the last 2 years of my life with somebody that I loved and they're no longer in my life. It's understandable that I'm feeling anxious because, I'm almost 35 and I'm worried that I might not meet anybody who I will ultimately like have that family with. It's understandable that I'm feeling scared or that I'm feeling confused or frustrated or angry or whatever, all of the emotions, because the reality is breakups and grief stir up all of our emotions. So just validate them. Do not create what we call these secondary emotions, that shame, that anxiety that comes out of judging the primary emotion. So like anxiety and shame can both be primary emotions as well, but that's when they're showing up in a healthy form. But when they're showing up as a result of judgment, that's what we call secondary emotions. So self-compassion, really adjust your expectations for like performance, mood, productivity. Grief, it really mimics depression. And so like there will be days where your energy is just so low. I've been having a lot of those lately because I think I'm like in the depression phase now. And you might feel like you just can't get out of bed. Go ahead.
That's so good that you're experiencing all that because I know, there are some people that may want to run from their feelings and emotions and want to just numb completely.
Totally.
You get broken up with, or you go through a breakup, guess what? You're at the bar drinking, or you book a trip to escape.
Yeah.
Or I'm not saying no one should like eat, pray, love. I think that's beautiful too. as long as you're just sitting there and having time to process your emotions, because they end up catching up with you anyway.
Totally. And I think, I mentioned that earlier, that I do think, unfortunately, men get the shorter end of the stick here because they're not as socialized to feel their emotions. And so they do tend to like party and, run and work and stuff like that more in response to breakups. And then they get like judged for it. And look, there is a certain amount of time we do have to put this shit on ice. And I think it can be very spiritually bypassing to be like, feel all of your feelings, like never, like, in a weird way, like even though most of the time spiritual bypassing is about numbing emotions, I think it's like that spiritual perfectionism is probably a better way of putting it, to say like, well, no, you should just spend all your time journaling and doing yoga. Like, it's okay to numb sometimes. It's okay. Yeah. Sometimes we have to. There's this great graph that I'll try to describe, but basically it describes grief as like, in the beginning, you have to either be, it's like a pie chart, and the pie is filled with all grief or all distraction. And like, you can only, like, you could slice it in half, and then it's half grief, half distraction, but there's no room for anything else. And then over time, you start to get these tiny little slivers of like presence, and like, it's neither grief nor distraction there. And so it takes time. But ultimately, you will start to have those little slivers of presence, or, being in the moment without having grief or distraction. And they're going to grow over time. But like right now for me, I think there's like a millimeter like sliver of that little pizza or cake or pie piece or whatever. Exactly.
I love the idea
and
of pie.
I don't even know if there's actually have been that millimeter yet. But it's, so in the meantime, then it's been mostly either grief or distraction. And you cannot go through grief 24/7. So you've got to distract yourself, and that's okay. But when it comes to going through the grief and finding healthy ways of processing, journaling has been huge for me. Yoga has been huge, going for long walks. I go for long walks, I do yoga, I dance a little bit here and there, I journal. I've listened to a lot of like audiobooks and podcasts around, attachment theory and healing and stuff, abandonment, stuff like that. Reddit has been amazing. I was never a Reddit fan before this, but like Reddit Breakups, I'm telling you, is like the best community. Anyone listening who's going through heartbreak, you have to join Reddit Breakups. It will be so healing for you. It's just like a beautiful community of people who are all going through breakups, and they all support each other, and it's so lovely.
Wonderful.
Oh my gosh, it's like it's great. It's such a good resource. Obviously therapy has been huge for me. I did a really powerful hypnotherapy session recently with my friend Celinda Costa. You can check her out and do one with her.
I want to check her out.
Yeah, she's great. And let's see, I have a coach as well, of course, like all the different sort of modalities. Acupuncture has been huge. Massage, I had like a guy come and do massage with me, because we hold a lot of trauma and grief in our bodies, so you want to try to move that through. I've been really mindful to know I haven't really had anything to drink. I've had like the occasional drink, but other than that, for me, alcohol doesn't really agree with me anyway, and particularly right now, it's just a depressant, and I know it would make me feel worse. But in the same breath, I've had a lot of weed gummies over this period of time. A lot of weed gummies.
Those are helpful.
Yeah, exactly. Which has been actually very helpful for like working through memories and processing and journaling and writing. I started my podcast, or created a podcast project around heartbreak, which is called Better Because of It, Stories of Heartbreak, Healing, and Growth. If anyone's interested in hearing some heartbreak podcasts or episodes. And yeah, I think those are like the main things in terms of like tools and coping mechanisms. I think just like really do not be hard on yourself, and surround yourself by people who've been through it and get it, because I really do believe there are two types of people in this world. I believe there are people who've had their heart broken and people who have not, and it's two different types of people. People who have not had their heart broken do not understand the excruciating pain of heartbreak. Like it is pain like no other. And I was like wailing the other day, like literally wailing, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is like, I'm like a mourning lady, like at a funeral, like in like like screaming, like it is.
And it's actually physically painful.
It is.
Too.
It's physically painful. There's been MRI studies that have shown it like lights up the same neural pathways or whatever as physical pain. And so like you just have to let yourself go through it. Do not judge yourself. Use it as an opportunity for spiritual awakening. Use it as an opportunity to practice being with your discomfort, because the tools you can possibly gain through heartbreak, you can take for the rest of your life. Like what I learned a decade ago in the heartbreak of 2011 was how to show up for myself and feel my emotions and practice self-compassion. And that was the most powerful tool I could have learned in my life. I used it up until this point, and I've used it through this breakup, but it's what's allowed me to, create my business, move to New York with like a suitcase, not knowing a soul, take risks, like, recover from my eating disorders. Like self-compassion has been my greatest tool. and the spirituality that's sort of dovetails with all of it. So, but I think other than that, like, of course, surround yourself by people who love you, and just know that it takes time. Like, it takes a long fucking time. Like, my heartbreak at 2011 took me a year and a half. And this one, I'm like, probably take me about the same. I'm like, that's okay. It doesn't mean that like every day is going to be awful or every moment's going to be awful. It just means that like there's still going to be sadness that comes around. And like that Rumi poem, like you just have to kind of welcome it and be like, okay, sadness, like welcome in, come have your cup of tea and we'll hang out. And know that life is we wouldn't, it's cliche, but like we would not know what joy and love and beauty is without the ugly parts, without pain, without loss and sadness. And so like this is just part of the spectrum of human emotion. I mean, in the book, When Things Fall Apart, like Pema Chodron, she says like, things come together and fall apart and come together and fall apart again. And, the idea is to basically make space for all of it. And I'm just in a period of things falling apart right now, and that's okay. Like that, again, I was in a period of things being together probably before the pandemic, and they'll come together again, and then they'll fall apart again, and then they'll come together again. So
I like that perspective, because this is going to be a crazy analogy, but I just remember in grad school, my roommate and I got a puppy, and it was the first time I had ever been responsible for keeping something alive and taking care of it. And I just remember how when we first got him, he did not know that we would be coming home after we left, because he would obviously bark and cry, and it was like torture. I'm like, oh my God, this dog is losing his mind.
Yeah.
But after a while, he realized, oh wait, they do come home.
Yeah.
So when they leave me, I'm not going to be so crazy.
Exactly.
And it's
attachment
kind
right
of
there.
like, yeah. And it just reminds me, because when you're going through anything but heartbreak,
Yeah.
just know that there is another side, and there is, light at the end of the tunnel. Even when you're in like your darkest moment, you're like, this fucking sucks. But I know, like, if you can tell yourself, like, I know they'll come home again.
Totally.
And I know that this will be, and we'll end up being okay.
Yeah, and I know I'll love again, and I know that I'll look back on this, like in the same way I look back on the heartbreak of 2011, I look back on it and I'm like, wow, that was the most profound experience I went through, and at least in my adult life, and truly shaped who I am and how I see the world and how I see myself. And it was like a hell of a year, to year and a half, but it was so fucking worth what I got out of it. And so I'm trying to kind of take the same approach here. Like, it's going to be a hard, few months or year or whatever, but I know that it's like an investment, like as long as I'm awake for it, as long as I'm taking the opportunities that come along the way, it's an investment in my future self, and knowing what I need and deserve, and learning how to show up for myself in new ways that I didn't even know I could. And so I figure if I have even half of the growth or 25% of the growth that I had from the heartbreak of 2011, like, I can't wait to meet my future self.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Oh my God. Wait, okay. Last question.
Sure.
Do you think, kind of like a twofold question, do you think two people can be friends after a breakup, and is that healthy? And related, should you keep in contact with your ex? And should you unfollow them?
Yeah, I definitely think, unless it's a very rare case, unfollow. Do not keep in contact. It is so hard it's so interesting, because it's like, there was a time before social media and like cell phones where you had clean breaks, like somebody would have to show up at your door or like call you and like leave a message on the answer, and you have to call them back, or like, you'd pick up the phone, I guess, and didn't have caller ID, and like they would try to beg for you back maybe, but like it was so much different. It had to be like, it was a very like active act of seeking contact. Whereas now it's like, oh God, I mean, I was like, fuck, like I tried to unfollow. I mean, I've blocked, I've unfollowed, I've done all the things, but it's like, then there's like the mutual friends, and then you see the story, and then like, you're like hit with it, and you're like, oh, and then like all the emotions surge through your body, and you're like, God damn it, my day is ruined. And it probably wasn't gonna be that great anyway, but so yes, so I'm a huge believer in at least temporarily, like block, unfollow, remove yourself, like, and don't try to be really honest with yourself too, because I think sometimes we're like, oh, but like I still need to be friends with that person, or keep following that person who was like friends with my ex who I like never really knew, because like for this, it's like, no, unfollow, like if you really need to like send a message and explain why, like do that, but there's no reason to leave yourself vulnerable, I think, to triggering content. And you can always go back and follow them again, or be
Yeah.
friends with them again. But I think like for a period of healing, it's very hard to heal. There is sort of, and I've gone through this recently, like there is sort of a detox phase. Like there is sort of an addiction of a relationship,
Yes.
right? And you have to kind of detoxify yourself or detox
Really
yourself.
great way to put it.
Yeah, like, and you, I mean, honestly, like I've been kind of trying to see this as an addiction. Like I need to cut myself off from the addiction to really, be able to see it with a clear mind, because I haven't been able to see it with clear mind until recently. And so I think, yes, like cut yourself off as much as you can from communication. Obviously there's like logistical stuff generally that needs to happen, especially if you're living together or have like kind of mutual like investments in various different areas and stuff, and friendships and whatnot. But do try to have like, give yourself a period of that can at least give you the opportunity to heal where you're not in contact with that person. And then in terms of like being friends with exes, it's interesting you asked that. A friend was talking to me about this yesterday. I don't know. I think I've heard of it and seen it, and I want to believe that, it is authentic for people. I think what is challenging is just when you do end up getting in a new relationship, what happens to your friendship with this ex? Because it may not be respectful to your future partner, maintaining that connection. I think it's Stan Tatkin who talks a lot about like the couple bubble, and it's really important to preserve that and nurture that and make your partner, I believe at least, make your partner feel really emotionally safe. And so it may so happen that, this friendship that you have with an ex, it may not have a lot of like integrity to it if when they start dating somebody new or you start dating somebody new, you can't be friends anymore. And that could be really painful for either of you. And in the same breath, like, how would you feel if they started dating somebody new? Would that be hard for you to see? Like, would you go for my litmus test with exes when I've dated people has been like, okay, if the three of us can go for brunch, it's cool. Like, let's all go for brunch together,
Yeah.
If it's a case where like they're going off to have brunch without me, then I'm like, I don't know, that doesn't feel so good to me.
No.
So I mean, I don't really have like a clear answer, but I do think it's just about being conscious about like the why and whether or not it's something that like really does enhance your life or could be actually more of like a liability than anything.
Right. Like, what is this friendship? Is it really true, or is it you just leaving the door open?
Exactly.
And that doesn't make your new partner, if you have a new partner, feel very safe.
Yeah,
So.
exactly.
And just put yourself in that new partner's shoes too.
Totally.
And think, if I started dating somebody and they were still really close with their ex, would that make me feel safe in this relationship?
Right.
Or would that make me question something?
Yeah.
So it all depends, because every situation is very unique. But generally speaking, I would think
Totally.
not
And it's interesting because actually like two of my best guy friends are guys I've dated for like a hot minute. Like I dated them for like 2 weeks, and then it switched. And it's been interesting because like I'm very close with both of them. And one like is married. I love his wife. I was like his best woman or whatever at his wedding and stuff. And the three of us always hang out together. And that's like feels, but it's interesting because the other one, my friend recently, I was an issue in his relationship with his former partner. And it was just an interesting place for me to go, because I was like, I think this is something you need to be really clear about whenever you start a new relationship, like that I'm like a close friend that's not going anywhere, because otherwise it will feel uncomfortable for them. And we need to do what we can to make her feel safe in our relationship. And it was hard because I don't live in the same city as them. But anyway, this may be unnecessary information.
Yeah. But just in general, I think it's a case-by-case basis.
Totally.
But generally speaking, it's probably not a great idea.
Yeah.
Unless there is a true deep friendship there. Regardless, the importance is like leaving space and making your new partner feel safe. So that whole ex thing is complicated, but cool. I think that's it. I mean, we talked about so much.
I know. Oh my gosh.
This was amazing. Thank you for being so vulnerable.
You're welcome.
And so open about everything. I think people listening who are not who have been through heartbreak, are going through it, can like find so much wisdom and insight into what you just shared. So I think it'll help a lot of people.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for getting it out of me. It feels good to talk about.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hopefully it's healing.
It is. No, thank you.
I hope you all enjoyed that episode as much as I did. And if you are going through a heartbreak right now, my heart goes out to you, and I'm sending you the biggest hug. And I hope that something in this episode sparked some inspiration and was helpful for you. If you did enjoy the episode, please remember to subscribe on iTunes so that you get notified when there's a new episode available. Super easy. And if you do want to support the podcast, please leave a rating as well. It means so much to me. For more resources on everything that we discussed, including all the resources Megan mentioned, the books, etc., go to healthaccomplice.com and go to the podcast page, and you'll find this episode with all the show notes, but I've also included the links to everything we talked about in the show notes below. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you on the next episode.